In this video, I am going to teach you the Pegasus system opening for white, and I will be doing this by showing you my recent over-the-board game. I actually haven't played any over-the-board chess in more than 2 years. I'm finally making my return to over-the-board chess, and this was my very first game, so that's already exciting. I will be teaching you the Pegasus system, and I will be also teaching you a lot of very important things about pawn structure. So what is the Pegasus system opening? It is my own opening system that starts with d4, and then on the next move we play knight to d2. There are a couple of reasons we do this. First of all, by playing this opening, we are literally 100% sure that the opponent is not prepared to play against this, because this is really not a well-known opening, and it's also a very simple opening to play for white. There is not that much that you need to know to execute this opening well. So d4, d5, knight to d2. And they play knight to f6. All right. The main plan from the Pegasus system opening is that we would like to play the move pawn e4 if we can. Most of the time that won't be available in the beginning if your opponent plays this d5 knight to f6 combination. If they play something else, sometimes yes, we can play that move pawn to e4. But here that's not going to be possible, so we need to accept that and play pawn to e3 for now, and then later we will be trying to push the pawn to e4. My opponent plays bishop f5, and this is one of a couple of different variations that can happen in this opening. They can play bishop to f5. They could also choose to play e6. And there is a slight difference depending on what they play. Because if they play e6, then that means that their bishop is still stuck. I will show you that. This did not happen in the game, but this could have happened. If they play e6, which is common, then their bishop is stuck, and it will be developed probably somewhere over here. If they play bishop to f5, then they develop their bishop, but that also means that they have left behind a weakness here. They have left behind a weakness on the b7 square that we are going to try to attack. We continue by playing pawn to c4. The logic behind this move is that we are trying to use a flank pawn to get rid of a central pawn. The best thing that could happen to us would be if black takes this. That did not happen in the game, but imagine if they take this. We can just develop the bishop, and just like that, we have two pawns in the center, we have two developed pieces, and we also removed a very annoying pawn that was preventing our e4 plan. So that's the basic strategy behind c4. If black doesn't protect this with a pawn, I will also be capturing their pawn, because then we are eliminating their central pawn with c4. In the game, my opponent played pawn to c6, which is a good move, protecting that central pawn. And here we just continue with development, simply playing knight to f3. I also made this as a bit of a waiting move because I wanted my opponent to finish by playing e6. And by playing e6, they have finished building this triangle, which is very common. And also they locked out their bishop. The bishop can no longer go back, which means that this is a weakness that the bishop can no longer protect. And we are immediately going to use that to our advantage. Queen to b3, attacking that weak pawn. Which means that the opponent needs to do something about this. They could push it. They could protect it with a queen. They will need to make one of those moves. Most of the time, low-rated players end up pushing, which also creates some future problems for them on the c6 square. But this opponent decided to play queen to c7, which is one of the best moves that can happen. The second benefit that we have from playing a move like queen d3 is that we don't just attack this pawn, we also protect the d3 square, which is where we want to develop our bishop. So we can develop the bishop to d3. That would otherwise not have been possible because they would have just captured it. If they captured this bishop, which happened in the game, that's not a problem. Our queen was no longer useful here, so now the queen has moved to the d3 square, and this is a very typical setup that you get from this opening, where we have the three pawns in the center and we have the queen literally supporting all of these important central squares. My opponent then ended up playing knight to d7, and at this very moment, I was a little bit confused. I was actually getting into my own head because I thought that my opponent had maybe prepared something as he was making his moves very, very quickly. One of the things that you need to watch out for in this position and in this opening in general is that you should try to make the move e5 impossible for black. You don't want them to be able to play the move e5. And at this very moment, they technically could play e5 because they have two pieces protecting it, and I can capture with the pawn, I can capture with the knight, but in the end they would end up with a queen in the center. It's not a big problem, and there are many things that you can do from here. Castling, which I did not do in the game, castling would definitely be a good move. b3 could also possibly be a good move. All of those could work. I decided to play pawn to e4, which is also a good move. All of these moves can work. Depending on what you want to achieve. But pawn to e4 is a very standard strategy in the Pegasus system opening. The main plan behind pawn e4 is that we want to eventually play pawn to e5. And we want to see if we can attack that knight, get rid of the knight, and then suddenly there will be a weakness here on the h7 pawn. And there is a general rule in the Pegasus system that if you can play e4 without losing material, you should always do it. Okay, which is what happened in this game. My opponent didn't take. They could have taken, in which case I would take with the knight, and if they take once more, I will take with the queen. And this is also a very standard position that we get, where we have two pawns in the center, and then we have the queen here, and later we will be also attacking the opponent's king side, which did not happen in the game. In the game, my opponent decided to counter by playing bishop to b4. This is actually an interesting move, because by playing bishop to b4, they pinned his knight, and if we are not careful, they might be capturing this pawn in the center, because right now this pawn in the center is only protected by the queen. It's no longer protected by the knight, because the knight is pinned to the king. So they would be able to take this. So we need to solve this, which is why I decided to play the move pawn to e5. In general, pawn to e5 is my plan, so we can play the move pawn to e5 here, attacking the knight, and the knight has to move. Knight comes forward, and of course I cannot capture this and win a pawn, because currently I am actually pinned. This knight is pinned to my king. All right. So I decided, let's solve this pin, and I played the move pawn to a3. And there is actually a slightly better move here, which would have been exchanging pawns in the center. I will talk about that in a moment, because we are about to get into the pawn structure aspect of this lesson. I play pawn to a3. They take. And here I was really thinking, like, how do I want to continue with this game? And I think that I made the wrong choice here, looking back at it afterwards. This is a very important moment, because my opponent just decided to give us a bishop. And if we take back with the knight, which is what I did, then for the rest of this game, we are going to have a knight and a bishop versus a knight and a knight. This is something that you have to think about very strategically. Whenever there is an exchange between knights and bishops, that means that we are going to create an imbalance in the position. Imbalance is just a fancy chess word that means a difference in the position. We have a strategic difference. The difference is that we have a bishop and they don't. In general, having the bishop is favorable. It is something that we would want. In this particular case, it could actually lead to trouble long term. Why? If they take, which happened, and I capture back, there is a move that black can play here, which is the move pawn takes c4, queen takes c4, and white ended up having a backward pawn. This pawn is a backward pawn. That means that this is a pawn that we can no longer push forward, and it is also not protected by any other pawns. I knew that I was going to get this backward pawn, but I somewhat misevaluated this position. I thought that it wouldn't be a problem because of some possible lines, which could happen, which didn't happen in the game. I was looking at maybe castling, and then maybe this bishop going in, and then the bishop eventually ending up on like the d6 square, something like this. And I thought that this would be a very good position for black and for white. And it's actually not such a bad position. But in the end, we have a structure with a lot of pawns in the center. We still have this backward pawn problem. Yes, we do end up with the bishop, but studying the position afterwards, I do understand now that this was actually not the most optimal approach. So going back to the point where I offered them this trade, this was the very important decision moment, meaning that I should have captured that with the bishop, which could have led to them capturing with the knight, me capturing with the knight, them capturing the pawn, me capturing the pawn, and then eventually we are going to get this outpost square for the knight. And this is going to be a better position, because this knight is more useful on the d6 square than the bishop would be. So important, if you see yourself ending up with a backward pawn, what you need to do is you need to try to see if you can blockade the file so that the rooks cannot go to that file, because black could easily put rooks on that file and then also put pressure and try to win the pawn. And blockading it with a knight is always superior to blockading it with a bishop. So that was a small strategic mistake. I think the only mistake really that I made in this game. Going back again to this very important exchange that was going on, there was actually something that I could have done to avoid all of this, which would have been capturing on d5 earlier. Because yes, we have this pawn that is also technically a backward pawn. It's not protected and it cannot move forward, but at least there is no pressure upon this pawn. And then we could play a3, and after they capture, we could then choose to capture with the knight, capture with the bishop, and we would achieve almost an identical position to what we had before, but with one big difference, that this pawn on c6 has moved to d5. And this would be a way better position for white to play, because we still have that plan of putting the bishop there. We still have the bishop versus knight advantage, and this is going to be a good position. So this shows how important even a single move can be, because it can completely shift the entire strategy for the rest of the game. And especially pawn moves and piece exchanges between bishops and knights are very valuable. So I did make a small mistake there by capturing with the knight. Okay. And here my opponent really surprised me. I was 100% sure that they were going to take the pawn and then do everything that they can to build up pressure on this file. But instead they made a strategic mistake. They moved the rook to this file already before capturing the pawn, and this actually just completely loses them the game instantly, because now I will have the very typical attacking plan in the Pegasus system, which will be using the bishop and the queen on the king side and attacking here. That is one of the most standard plans in the Pegasus system. Also, strategically, this move is completely wrong. I have a general rule, which is that you only want to move your rook to a file if you are 100% sure that that file is going to open up. In this position, my opponent is not sure yet that this is going to open up, because what I can do is I can take. And if I take, he'll have to recapture with a pawn, could be the e pawn or the c pawn. And after he recaptures with a pawn, that file is going to be closed. So pay attention to this in your own games as well. Only move your rook over once you are already certain that either the file is open or you can open it, and it's not possible for the opponent to stop that. So that was a strategic mistake here by my opponent. Then they ended up taking with the e-pawn. Okay, I think taking with the c-pawn makes a little bit more sense, because now we even have this pawn push, but it would also run into trouble. And I had calculated everything, and I knew that this was going to happen eventually, and that I would have a winning attack here. It is white to play, and white has a winning move immediately. This is the first tactical puzzle, I would say. So if you want, you can always pause this video to see if you can find it. So the move that I played here is a very typical move in the Pegasus system. Queen to g3, and queen to g3 wins the game. Queen to g3 wins the game on the spot. There is nothing anymore that black can do. And I will show you why. If black responds with castling, which is what most people would do, we play bishop to h6. And this is a very typical tactic that you can get in d4 openings. We have a checkmate threat. The only way to solve it is pushing the pawn, and then we win the exchange. We win a rook for a bishop. And that's a very typical plan in Pegasus system. To achieve this plan, we try to get this pawn structure, and we want to keep the dark squared bishop for later in the game and then combine it with the queen. So they cannot castle. They cannot castle, and they also need to fix this problem that g7 is under attack. So they could think about moving pawn to g6. But I had calculated that there was actually a second move that I would be able to play here as a follow-up that instantly wins the game. And I'm a little bit sad that this didn't happen, because it would have made for a more spectacular win and a more spectacular YouTube video as well. Which is that white has the move, if you want, pause, but white has the move pawn to e6, winning a piece anyways, because we are attacking the knight and we are attacking the queen at the same time. If black captures our queen, which is the move that makes the most sense, we simply capture the knight with a check, and then we capture back the queen. And we are up a bishop, and we are down a pawn in exchange for that bishop. So I calculated this as well, that basically after the move, queen to g3 in this position, we would be winning, because castling doesn't work. and pawn to g6 doesn't work. I think the single best try that they can do is probably play the move king f8, because the king holds on to the pawn. The move e6 doesn't work because it doesn't come with winning a piece, because there is no check when we capture the knight. We would actually just be losing a pawn. This position is, of course, still completely winning for white, because white can castle and white can continue the rest of the game attacking that king side, and that king is going to be stuck here. The position can be opened up. This rook is also out of the game, but it would have been probably the best way for my opponent to continue. Instead, my opponent actually found a very creative move instead, which is knight to f8, giving away the pawn and then playing knight to g6 in an attempt to see if they can limit the power of my queen a little bit and also hold the position basically and try to play on. And I will now show you how you can convert an advantage like this. We basically only have a one pawn advantage, but I knew that this was going to be enough to win the game, and that's what I'm going to teach you. So first of all, I was thinking that there were a lot of possible tactics available in this position. The most interesting would be at some point playing a move like e6, technically, because they cannot capture this, otherwise they would be losing the queen, and by doing this, we would also be able to open up the position further. I decided to start with the move h4. h4 is a good move because this threatens to attack the knight. And if that knight has to move, the knight actually barely has any squares. And if the knight moves, the rook would also drop, because the rook holding on basically entirely depends on the knight being on g6. So that's why I played this. I was hoping that my opponent would respond with h5, which didn't happen in the game. But if they do play h5, then they have multiple problems. For example, that move that I talked about, e6, is now possible. They cannot capture because they would lose the queen. And if they don't capture, they also have to watch out that eventually that knight might be dropping as well, because the knight doesn't really have that much support anymore. So this was another interesting move I was looking at. They instead decided to go king d7, basically give up another pawn just to get the king over there, which is going to give them the potential for an endgame, although that they are down 2 pawns. All right. Now that we are up 2 pawns, this is a position where I think anyone should be confident that you can convert this into a win, because we have a 2 pawn advantage and we have multiple passed pawns. The way that you can convert this, which I'm going to briefly explain, is that we literally just need to start pushing all of the pawns, literally push all of the pawns forward, and eventually something is going to collapse. So h5, knight has to move back. Knight doesn't have many good squares. f4, I'm just moving my pawns forward. My opponent played knight to e6, good move, attacking these 2 pawns, so we need to spend at least one move defending them. And then they played the move rook to f8, again putting pressure on the pawns, so I need to spend the move defending them. I decided to not castle here on the king side, because this is where I will be doing a massive pawn storm, and it doesn't make sense to put the king there. It's going to be better eventually maybe to put the king here, or just keep the king in the center, really. All right, then my opponent played the move rook here. Again, really, they are doing all they can to try to stop the pawn storm, but really it is already too late. Instead of responding to this, I had calculated that I could play f5, attacks the knight. Knight has to move back, blocks in the rook, attacks the 2 pawns, but then we have g4. And basically the last 4 moves, all I have been doing is moving these pawns forward. And these pawns are unstoppable. It might take a while, but these pawns will be promoting. And that is what I want to teach here, that once you have this 2 pawn advantage, it's just about keep pushing the pawns, keep making progress. But we do have to still be careful, because if we do a wrong pawn push, let's say that we attack here, suddenly everything can still collapse. My opponent would definitely see this. They would start picking up these pawns, and then it becomes more difficult. So we need to push our pawns, but we also need to make sure that we don't lose any in the process. My opponent is doing what they can to blockade the pawns, meaning put pieces in front of them, try to make it hard for me to push them, but they are so limited in space. And when I talk about space, I am talking about squares. Like this knight only has 1 future square. This rook only has 2 future squares. Like they are really, the pieces are getting stuck, basically. The pieces are getting stuck. And I try to use that to my advantage. I played check, and then I played bishop to e5. And this rook is literally stuck. Like this rook is stuck. it cannot do anything. It could maybe go to h6, but then they are just letting me push, and afterwards this will be trouble. I could take here, I could try to promote, I could play f6, so that wouldn't be good. So basically the rook has to go back, but they are so running out of squares for their pieces. I decided to attack the rook again, which maybe wasn't necessary, but I had calculated that there was an option to trap this rook. If they go forward, I would play bishop e7, and the rook is trapped, because the rook cannot go to these squares, it cannot go to this square, and if it goes to h6, which is the final square, the bishop just follows it and then eventually traps the rook. So my plan was here to see if I could trap the rook by playing the move bishop to d6, but they didn't go here, they instead went here. But okay, we are making progress. At this point, I was thinking that there could be a potential breakthrough right here, because I mean, my bishop is now better placed. The pieces are really running out of squares. Like, I had calculated that if they did this, the knight would be out of squares, but we still have a problem. I was thinking about the move h6. That's basically what I had calculated 6 moves ago when I started pushing all these pawns and taking away squares from the rooks. I had calculated that either this rook would end up being trapped, or it would go here, which would trap the knight. But then I suddenly realized something. If I do this move, which I didn't play in the game, there is knight takes pawn takes pawn, rook takes pawn with a check, bishop blocks the check, rook takes pawn. And am I still winning? Yes. But where are all my pawns? They have disappeared. And now I have to play this endgame, which is going to be more difficult to convert. Because I need to try to find a way to trade the rooks. I only have one more pawn. It's not a passed pawn. So here is suddenly a moment where I realized that my my last 5 moves, all of this maneuvering, was maybe not that useful. I mean, h6 wins the game. I calculated everything well here, but it's more complicated than I wanted it to be. Which is why I decided to just castle, and then basically there is nothing that they can do. Because if the king is off this file, then the sacrifice loses its power. They have no moves, and if they play any move which didn't happen in the game, I would just activate my rook. Let's say they play any other move, again, which didn't happen in the game. I could then finally think about maybe h6, trapping the knight, and yeah, they don't have anything. My rooks are behind it. In the game, my opponent realized this, so they just said, okay, let me immediately sacrifice my knight for 2 pawns anyways. But I had seen that this would be losing for them because of check with the rook, take the rook, and then we simply have this, which is that we have 2 pawns supported by a rook, and that is what you want. In the endgame, there is only one rule to follow: PPP, push past pawn. I pushed my passed pawns, which are the pawns that can promote, and here I'm just going to create a new passed pawn, and you always want to have your rook behind the passed pawn. So after some piece shuffling, eventually I start pushing my pawn, pushing my pawn, PPP, push past pawn, that's the strategy. Check, and then here we are winning. We can just pick up this pawn, and then eventually the other ones are going to promote. So a very good game. Congratulations as well to my opponent, because my opponent ended up getting a 2250 performance rating in this game as well. I hope you found this helpful, and if you want to learn more about the Pegasus system opening, you should definitely go to pegasuschess.com.